Morgan Pitelka is a historian of Asia and a researcher internationally known for his expertise in Japanese art and culture, and his love of tea. After graduating from Oberlin College, Morgan earned a doctorate in East Asian Studies at Princeton University. He next taught for 8 years at Occidental College in Los Angeles. In 2013, he was named director of the Carolina Asia Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He chaired the Department of Asian Studies at UNC from 2019 to 2024 and is now a distinguished professor of history and Asian studies. The son of a potter, he has a lifelong passion for all things tea. Morgan Pitelka is the author of Spectacular Accumulation, a book on precious objects pursued by Japanese military leaders during the Shogun era. He has also written on interpreting medieval ruins and the value of material culture, tea culture, and raku potters. Let's welcome this remarkable tea historian and lecturer from North Carolina.
I'm really happy to be here talking with you today, Dan. Thanks.
500 years ago, Kyoto was the imperial capital of Japan, a thriving center of cultural creativity despite 2 centuries of civil war that ultimately devastated the city. Will you discuss tea's vibrant role in this period of war?
In Japanese history, tea has been used in different ways at different historical moments. My specialty is the late medieval and early modern period, especially the 16th and 17th centuries. And that also happens to be the most intensely active era in the culture of tea, when the elites, the samurai leaders, the wealthy merchants, the heads of Buddhist temples, pretty much universally were engaged in the active study of the tea ceremony and the use of tea culture as part of their political activities. So tea in that period was actually very closely intertwined with war. And so part of my research and part of my teaching is to understand that and to emphasize it, because I think if we erase the connection that tea had historically with power and with war, that's actually dangerous, right? To misunderstand the past is potentially to allow it to be repeated in ways that would be much more violent and destructive in the present. There's an idea in East Asian history and culture that there is the kind of sphere of military activity, and there's the sphere of literature and culture, right? In Chinese, this is known as wenwu, and in Japanese, it's bunbu. And the idea that these are separate, I think, is one of the great sort of myths, in a way, of East Asian history, because in the lives of leaders, the two were intertwined. Mm-hmm. So a shogun or a samurai warlord would ride his horse, leading his men into battle, and then in the aftermath, use a tea banquet, a tea gathering, as a way to kind of knit the warrior band back together. Some people had been lost, many acts of violence had been committed, and I think tea was one of many ritual practices that the samurai used to kind of recreate the warrior organization when it was frayed by the act of war. There also is a lot of evidence that the samurai used the arts of tea as rewards. So, if my general successfully topples that castle that I've sent him to defeat, I might reward him by gifting him the most famous tea bowl in my collection. You might think he would instead want a lot of land, a lot of prisoners, a lot of gold. But because these 16th and 17th century samurai cared so much about tea culture, the best reward you could possibly receive in many cases was a tea utensil. And then that would become part of your treasured collection that defined you as a warrior, not only your acts on the battlefield, but your collection of Chinese and Japanese ceramics made you great. And so that's a history that I think is worth celebrating and understanding. It's a reminder that practices that in the modern era we associate with meditation, self-knowledge, health, healing, have a complicated history that sometimes goes beyond just the spiritual dimension. And I'm really interested in delving into that. Later, when Japan in the late 19th and 20th centuries became a global power, had a militaristic empire, he played a role in new notions of Japanese identity, new notions of Japanese culture that evolved in response to the circumstances of the world at that time. And then when Japan lost the war and was so, soundly defeated and had to reinvent itself in the post-war era, he was kind of reconfigured once again to become associated with this idea of global peace. And it's a noble concept and an aspiration I am supportive of. But to me, we can't allow that post-war aspiration to erase the pre-war use of tea in very ideological ways and the close association of tea with war in the pre-modern era. So as a historian, as an educator, untangling that mess is sort of what I've committed my career to.
How has academic interest and appreciation of tea culture evolved?
I'm a specialist in Japan, and that gives me the opportunity to travel to Japan to do my research. And tea culture in Japan, both the tea ceremony, the kind of formal, I think most well-known version of tea culture in Japan is one part of the work that I do. But tea is also, of course, just an incredibly important beverage, and it's an industry in Japan. So those are both areas where collaboration is important. Because I'm a historian who's interested in art, I often meet with archaeologists. I go to museums that have big collections of tea utensils, of the different art forms that are associated with the history of tea. And more recently, I've become interested in tea and the environment. So, I'm interested in tea plantations, tea production, tea distribution in Japan. Japan is definitely one of many cultures in Asia that has such a deep engagement with tea in every aspect of life, whether it's the startling variety of tea beverages you can buy in a vending machine in any train station, to the temples and tea houses where you can have Chanoyu, the kind of formal tea ceremony with green matcha, to really understand the history of that whole range of tea culture in Japan. You have to talk to a lot of people, and you have to travel to a lot of places, because it's truly across the entire Japanese archipelago, in every city, the culture of tea is nuanced and local. And so part of the joy of studying the history of tea in Japan is trying to see that big picture through talking to folks all across the country. But then the global part is that, of course, tea is not limited to Japan, as the listeners of your podcast know so well. This is a global beverage, a global diverse culture. Understanding how tea bowls, for example, the ceramics made for drinking tea, came to Japan from China and Korea, but then evolved and changed in all kinds of interesting ways in Japan, and were distributed all over the world. Looking at the collections of Japanese ceramics in Europe and America and other places is equally important to seeing that big picture. So it really is a global process that involves a lot of exchange of ideas and a lot of collaborative research. So that's part of what makes taking part in this conference so exciting.
Will you share your thoughts on proposals to establish a global educational hub for tea?
It's a really intriguing proposition, and I've been so excited to see the work that Catherine and others have been doing. It is a great opportunity to see the cultural distinctions in how tea operates from one place to another, or from one moment to another. But then to also find the connecting through lines, because, of course, the tea plants have the same scientific properties, they have the same biochemical elements, and they interact with human bodies, of course, in these different cultures in similar ways. So the chance to understand how the cultural articulations of tea differ, but how the scientific environmental foundations are connected, I think is a wonderful chance. I mean, that's in my mind what global collaborative work is about. It's about seeing similarities and differences, right? We don't want to flatten the world. We don't want to say tea is the same everywhere. We're all the same because we all drink tea. That really risks erasing differences that matter. But on the other hand, we don't want to just say, well, Japanese tea culture and Chinese tea culture are so different. They have nothing in common. There's nothing to learn from one another. That's, I think, wrong and dangerous. They're fundamentally linked, and there's been so much mutual influence in both the past and the present. So there's something about a respectful and healthy engagement where we line up the things that help us to tell these cultures apart, but we scientifically understand what brings them together. In the humanities, there has recently been this environmental turn where those of us who study history and literature and art history more and more are interested in the natural world, the way that the environment shapes and contains artistic endeavors. And tea culture is such a natural topic for the environmental humanities because you have paintings, you have ceramics, you have literature, you have poetry, but you also have the biochemistry of tea plants, the effects of tea on the human body, the positive and negative outcomes of growing tea in tea plantations, right? So it's that linkage, I think, that is really important and exciting when I think about the Global Tea Institute.
Produced by Audavita Studios. Connect your voice to the world.